February 1986, a Friday afternoon. Four men in boiler suits gathered around the last loom in Salt's mill and began taking it apart. Photographer Ian Beasley raised his camera. In a few seconds, 133 years of roaring fell silent. What had they silenced? At its peak, Salt's mill was the largest building on Earth. 3,000 workers, 1,200 looms, 30,000 yards of cloth produced every single day. A man had built not just a factory here, but an entire world, and houses, schools, hospitals, a church, rising from the mud of industrial Yorkshire like something no one had dared imagine. Families were born here, grew old here, buried their dead here. Then one winter afternoon, four men with wrenches dismantled the last machine, and 133 years of sound drained from the building like breath leaving a body. No ceremony, no speech, only the scrape of metal on stone, and then nothing. How does an empire built on a dream collapse in a single generation? And what happens when the man who gave you everything also controls everything? Salt's Mill, the paradise with walls, Saltaire, West Yorkshire, 1853 to 1986. Bradford, 1840s. Stand in the center of the city on any morning and you cannot see the sky. Not because of cloud, because of smoke. Hundreds of mill chimneys pour black coal smoke across the rooftops from before dawn until long after dark. The river air runs not with water, but with dye. Purple, black, rust red, discharged directly from the factories lining its banks. In the back-to-back terraces packed behind the mill gates, 6 people share a single room. There is no running water. There is no sewage system. Children as young as 8 work 14-hour shifts in the spinning sheds. The average life expectancy of a Bradford textile worker is 28 years. Cholera returns every few seasons, moving quietly through the courts and alleyways, taking the weakest first. This is the world that made Titus Salt rich. By 1850, Salt was one of the wealthiest men in Yorkshire. He owned 5 mills scattered across Bradford, employed hundreds of workers, and had mastered something no other manufacturer in England had achieved: spinning the raw wool of South American alpacas into cloth of extraordinary quality. Silky, lightweight, with the luster of expensive fabric at a fraction of the price. European fashion houses ordered it. The Queen's dressmakers ordered it. Bradford wool merchants called him a genius. He was 47 years old and he had everything. What he chose to do next was not what anyone expected. A man of his wealth and standing in Victorian England had one obvious path forward: buy a country estate, step back from trade, and become a gentleman. It was what success looked like. It was what his peers did without question. Salt refused. Not out of modesty. He was not a modest man. He refused because he had looked too long at the conditions his workers lived in, and something in him could not let it go. He had seen the courts of Bradford where his employees went home each night. He had seen the children. He had breathed the air. In 1850, Salt made a decision that would consume the rest of his life. He would not simply build a bigger mill. He would build a new world entirely. A factory, yes, but also a village, a community, a place where his workers could live as human beings rather than units of production. He would move everything out of Bradford. He would start again from bare ground. He chose his site carefully, a wide stretch of land to the west of Shipley, sitting between 2 arteries of industrial England, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal to one side, the Midland Railway to the other. Raw materials could arrive by water or rail. Finished cloth could leave the same way. Nothing wasted, nothing delayed. He hired the Bradford architects Henry Lockwood and Richard Mawson to design the mill's exterior, a building in the grand Italian Renaissance style, stone-faced and symmetrical, something that looked less like a factory and more like a palace. When they presented their first drawings, Salt studied them for a long moment and said simply, "It is not half large enough." He sent them back to start again. He also brought in the engineer William Fairbairn, one of the most innovative industrial minds in Britain, to design the mill's interior. Fairbairn made one decision that would define the building. He placed every drive shaft, every boiler, every piece of dangerous moving machinery beneath the floor. For the first time in the history of English mill construction, The machines were arranged around the safety of the workers, not the other way around. In the winter of 1851, the first picks broke the frozen Yorkshire ground. There was no ceremony, no gathered crowd. Titus Salt stood at the edge of the field, looked out over the Bear River plain, and said nothing. He was building something no one had built before. Whether it would be what he imagined, that was another question entirely. The 20th of September, 1853, Titus Salt's 50th birthday. Bradford had never seen anything like it. 40,000 people, workers, merchants, civic dignitaries, journalists from London, gathered along the banks of the Aire to witness the opening of a building that had no equal on earth. Brass bands played. Flags flew from every window of the new village rising behind the mill. Salt himself sat at the head of a banquet table, laid for over 3,000 guests inside the mill's vast dining room, the longest table anyone present had ever seen beneath a single roof. The speeches went on for hours. The toasts were drunk in tea, Salt permitted nothing stronger, and nobody complained. Not that day. When the crowds finally walked through the mill gates and into the main weaving shed, many of them stopped and simply stood. The room was unlike anything that existed. 550 meters of floor space stretching before them, ceilings rising 9 meters overhead. Along both sides of the building, row upon row of tall arched windows flooded the interior with northern light. Clean even, shadowless. The walls were stone. The floor was smooth. The air, by the standards of every other mill in Bradford, was almost breathable. Salt had insisted on a ventilation system. He had insisted on the windows. He had told his architects that his workers would spend their lives in this building and it would not feel like a tomb. Beneath their feet, invisible, ran the true engine of the place. William Fairbairn's great innovation at Salt's mill was not the size of the building. It was what he chose to hide. Every drive shaft, every connecting rod, every piece of rotating machinery that in a conventional mill would have been exposed at waist height, grinding, crushing, taking fingers and hands and arms without warning, was sunk below the floor level. Workers walked above the machinery, not alongside it. Two enormous beam engines, each generating 1,250 horsepower, drove the entire mill from beneath. 10 coal-fired boilers fed them continuously. The power moved upward through the floor in controlled, measured increments. Present everywhere, visible nowhere. Above ground, the result was 1,200 looms operating simultaneously. Stand at one end of the weaving shed when they were all running, and the sound struck you like a physical force. 95 decibels, measurable 2 miles away in Bradford city center on a still morning. The floor vibrated underfoot. The air itself seemed to harden with noise. Lengths of unspun fiber drifted down from the frames like slow snow, settling on hair and eyelashes, coating every surface in a fine white film. The heat from the machinery and the bodies of the workers raised the temperature inside the shed year-round, summer and winter alike. And yet, by every standard that existed in 1853, this was the finest place to work in England. The machines did not reach out and take you. The light let you see what your hands were doing. The floor was swept. When you were ill, there was a hospital 40 yards from the mill gate. When your child needed schooling, there was a school. When you were old and could no longer work, there were almshouses at the edge of the village with your name already on the list. Titus Salt had thought of everything, almost everything. The secret behind Salt's mill was not the building, it was a fiber. Alpaca wool, harvested from the long-necked animals of the Peruvian Andes, had defeated every textile manufacturer in Bradford who had attempted to spin it. The raw fleece was too fine, too slippery, too unpredictable. Mills tried and abandoned it. It sat in warehouses across Yorkshire, unwanted, written off as commercially useless. In the 1830s, a young Titus Salt walked into one such warehouse, ran the fiber between his fingers, and saw something no one else had seen. He bought the entire stock, 500 bales, for almost nothing. His father thought he had lost his mind. He had not lost his mind. He had found his empire. After years of experimentation, Salt solved what Bradford could not. By combining alpaca with a cotton warp thread, he produced a cloth of extraordinary character. Lightweight, with the surface sheen of expensive silk, warm without being heavy, and priced far below anything comparable on the market. The moment it appeared in the fashion houses of London and Paris, orders flooded in. Ladies' dresses, travel coats, evening wear for women who wanted the appearance of luxury without its cost. The cloth traveled to every corner of Europe. The royal household ordered it. Salt became the only man in England who could produce it at scale, and he kept that advantage for decades. By the time Salt's mill opened in 1853, the alpaca trade alone was generating wealth that Bradford had no framework to measure. Salt poured that wealth back into the ground. Rising behind the mill, street by street, year by year, the village of Saltaire took shape. 850 stone-terraced houses, solid, dry, each one fitted with running water and gas supply at a time when most Bradford workers had neither. 21 named streets, a hospital, a school large enough for every child in the village, public bathhouses, a library with a reading room, a concert hall, a billiard room, a science laboratory, a gymnasium, a park along the north bank of the river, allotments, a boathouse, a church, grand, Italian-fronted, set in its own landscape garden, that could seat a congregation of 1,000. By 1871, Saltaire had 4,389 residents. One of them was a young woman named Margaret Illingworth. Margaret had grown up in a back-to-back terrace in Bradford. 6 people to one room, no window that opened, a shared privy in the yard used by a dozen families. She came to Salt's mill at 19, trained as a weaver, and was allocated a 2-room cottage on Victoria Road. The first morning she woke there, she lay still for a long moment before she understood what was different. It was quiet. Her room did not smell of other people. Through the window she could see a strip of sky. She wrote in her diary that year, "I feel for the first time that I am a person." But later, much later, she wrote something else. A single line, undated, near the back of the same notebook. "I could not leave even if I wished to. None of us can." She was not wrong, and Titus Salt knew it. There was no pub in Saltaire, not one. In a region where the public house was as fundamental to working-class life as the church, where men gathered after shifts to drink, argue, rest, and be human together, Saltaire had none. Salt had designed it that way from the beginning, and when people asked him why, he gave them the answer they expected: his faith, his congregationalist values, the evils of drink. It was a clean, righteous explanation, and most people accepted it without pressing further. The truth was more precise. Salt had calculated, with the same cold accuracy he applied to his looms and his ledgers, that a drunk worker made mistakes. A hungover worker was slow. A worker who spent his wages at a public house on Saturday night was a worker who came in depleted on Monday morning. The ban on alcohol in Saltaire was not an act of moral conviction. It was an act of industrial efficiency dressed in the language of religion. Salt even swept the floors of the mill canteen after every meal break and sold the collected breadcrumbs to local farmers as pig feed. Every possible source of waste was converted into profit. His workers' sobriety was simply one more resource to be managed. The list of prohibitions extended further than most residents cared to admit. Gambling was forbidden. Political gatherings were forbidden. Hanging laundry from the front of a house was forbidden. It spoiled the appearance of the streets. Informal football in the road was forbidden. Any activity not expressly permitted by the framework Salt had designed for his village simply did not happen. There were no written rules posted on walls. There did not need to be. Everyone understood. The architecture of control at Saltaire was not built from locks and bars. It was built from dependency. Consider the position of a salt mill worker in 1860. He rented his house from the mill. If he lost his job, he had 2 weeks before he also lost his home. He bought his food from the shop Salt had established in the village, conveniently located, competitively priced, and owned by the same man who signed his wage slip. He worshipped in the church Salt had built, where the minister preached sermons Salt had not written, but had certainly never discouraged. His children attended the school Salt had funded, where they learned the values Salt considered appropriate for the children of his workforce. One man controlled the work, the home, the food, the faith, and the education of an entire community. And the wages, always, were set just precisely enough. Enough to live well by Bradford's standards, not enough to save the sum required to rent a house elsewhere, learn a different trade, or imagine a life outside the mill's long shadow. Salt's critics, and there were critics, though they spoke carefully, pointed to this with particular bitterness. He had not trapped his workers with chains. He had trapped them with comfort. He had made leaving feel not just difficult, but ungrateful. Saltaire was, by every measurable standard, the finest place for a textile worker to live in Victorian England. It was also a place from which almost no one ever left. To understand Saltaire honestly, you must stand in both places at once. Step outside the village gates and walk 3 miles east into Bradford city center, the Bradford that existed at the same moment, in the same county, under the same gray sky. What you find there reframes everything. Courts of back-to-back housing so dense that sunlight never reaches the ground floor. Open sewers running alongside sleeping children. Infant mortality rates among the highest in England. Tuberculosis moving through the lodging houses so efficiently that landlords stopped asking new tenants their names. The average life expectancy in the worst Bradford parishes in the 1860s was not 28 years. It was 18. 18 years. Less than the age Margaret Illingworth had been when she first walked through the gates of Salt's mill and felt for the first time like a person. Against that reality, Saltaire was not a gilded cage. It was salvation. Salt's workers had dry houses. Their children did not die of cholera at 3 years old. They could read. The library was free and open 6 days a week. They could hear music. The concert hall held regular performances. They aged into almshouses rather than workhouses. These were not small things. These were the difference between a life and a slow death. And the people who lived in Saltaire understood the distinction with absolute clarity because most of them had come from the alternative. And yet, the question that Saltaire could never fully answer, the question that Margaret Illingworth wrote in the back of her notebook, that Salt's critics raised in pamphlets, that historians have turned over for 150 years, is not whether Saltaire was better than Bradford. It plainly was. The question is what it cost, not in rent or wages, in something harder to measure. When a single man controls where you live, what you eat, where your children learn, and where you pray, and when leaving means losing all of it simultaneously, the word for your situation is not gratitude. The word is dependence. And dependence, however kindly administered, is not freedom. Titus Salt was not a cruel man. By the standards of his age, he was remarkable, genuinely concerned with the physical well-being of his workforce in ways that most of his contemporaries found eccentric, even suspicious. He visited the sick. He funded the almshouses from his own pocket. He walked the streets of Saltaire in the evenings and knew his workers by name. But he never once asked them what they wanted. It did not occur to him to ask. He already knew what they needed, and he had built it for them. And the assumption buried inside that generosity that he knew better, that his judgment was sufficient, that their role was to receive rather than to choose, was the assumption that Saltaire could never escape, no matter how wide its windows or how well swept its floors. Titus Salt built a cage made of good intentions, and when he died, the cage remained. But the man who had made it bearable, the man whose presence had given it meaning and whose authority had given it order, was gone. What happened next would take only 16 years. The 29th of December, 1876. Titus Salt died at Crownest, his private residence outside Bradford, at the age of 73. Bradford stopped. 100,000 people lined the streets for the funeral procession, a number that exceeded the entire workforce of every mill in the city combined. They stood in the January cold without being asked, without organization, without instruction. Shops closed. Mills fell silent for the day, the only time in the history of Salt's mill that the looms stopped voluntarily for a reason other than machinery failure or strike action. The procession moved slowly through streets hung with black cloth, past the faces of men and women who had spent their working lives inside the building Salt had raised from bare ground. He was interred in the mausoleum he had built for himself, directly beside the Congregational Church facing the mill. Even in death, he was positioned to watch over it. What he could not watch over was what came next. His son, Titus Salt Jr., assumed control of the company. He was not his father. Few men could have been, but the distance between them was particular and damaging. Where the elder Salt had possessed an instinct for both innovation and caution, an ability to take large risks at precisely the right moment and consolidate carefully afterward, Titus Jr. moved in the opposite direction. He invested heavily in American markets during a period of significant instability. He deferred decisions about modernizing the mill's aging machinery, equipment that in some sections dated back to the building's opening in 1853. His brothers George and Edward, both holding positions within the company, provided neither the talent to compensate for his weaknesses nor the will to challenge his direction. The machinery grew older. The market shifted. The Bradford textile trade, which had seemed as permanent as the stone hills surrounding it, began to reveal the first thin fractures of a structure under pressure. By 1887, Titus Salt Jr. was dead, the strain of managing a declining business having consumed him before his time. The company passed to the remaining family partners, Charles and William Stead, who struggled to hold together what was already coming apart. In 1892, just 16 years after the death of the man who had built it, the firm of Sir Titus Salt, Baronet, Sons and Company, entered voluntary administration. The entire empire went to auction. The mill, the 850 houses, the school, the hospital, the concert hall, the almshouses, the church. Everything Titus Salt had spent the second half of his life constructing, sold in a single transaction to a consortium of 4 Bradford businessmen who had played no part in building any of it. The Salt family name remained above the mill gate. The Salt family was gone. Workers who had known the old man, who had watched him walk the streets of Saltaire in the evenings, nodding to them by name, stood at their looms the morning after the sale was announced and understood something that no one said aloud. The world Salt had built for them had just become someone else's asset. Of the 4 men who purchased Salt's mill in 1892, only one left a mark on it worth remembering. James Roberts had started working in wool mills at the age of 11. Not as a manager's son learning the trade from a distance, as a child laborer, on the floor among the machines. He knew what the work cost in the body and what it produced in the ledger, and he understood both with equal clarity. By the time he acquired Salt's mill as part of the consortium, he was a wealthy man, but he had not forgotten where he had started, and that memory shaped how he ran the place. Roberts invested. He extended the mill, modernized sections of the machinery, and rebuilt the workforce to its largest number in the building's history. Over 4,000 workers at peak operation, more than had ever worked under Titus Salt himself. He also carried Saltaire's peculiar tradition of paternalism forward, funding improvements to the village, endowing educational institutions, and giving Roberts Park, on the north bank of the river, to Bradford Council in 1920, naming it after his son. But Roberts was not Salt. He was a businessman first, and his instincts pulled him outward as much as inward. He had significant commercial interests in Russia, spoke the language fluently, traveled there regularly, understood the market. For years, those interests were profitable. Then in 1917, the Russian Revolution erased them almost overnight. A substantial portion of Robert's fortune vanished in the space of months. He had no sons left to inherit. 3 had died young, and his 4th had been seriously wounded in the First World War. In 1918, with no successor and a diminished estate, Roberts sold Salt's mill in the Saltaire village to a syndicate of Bradford wool merchants. He died in 1920. He is buried in East Sussex, far from the mill that had defined the middle years of his life. What followed was a slow dispersal of everything Salt had held together by force of personality and concentrated ownership. The new syndicate, the Hill and Whitehead families, incorporated the business as Salt's Saltaire Limited in 1923, converting it to a public company to raise capital during difficult economic conditions. In 1933, in a decision that would have been unthinkable under Titus Salt, the company sold almost all of the village houses and shops to the Bradford Property Trust. The community Salt had kept unified under a single controlling hand was broken into separate ownerships for the first time in its 80-year history. Then, in 1958, Illingworth Morris plc acquired the business for £4,700,000, a corporate takeover by a larger textile group attempting to consolidate the industry's shrinking returns through scale. Professional managers replaced family owners. Efficiency targets replaced personal obligation. The mill continued to operate, but something in its character had shifted permanently. Salt's mill had survived the death of its founder. It had survived 2 world wars, 4 changes of ownership, and the slow dismantling of everything Salt had built around it. What it could not survive was already gathering beyond the Yorkshire hills. In the early 1950s, Bradford still called itself the wool capital of the world, and the title was not vanity. It was geography, history, and industrial fact combined. The hills of West Yorkshire held the largest concentration of textile manufacturing on earth. The smoke from the mill chimneys was so familiar that locals no longer saw it. The rhythm of shift changes, thousands of workers moving through the streets at the same hour, morning and evening, was the rhythm of the city itself. Salt's mill was part of that rhythm, as it had been for 100 years. The looms ran, the cloth went out, the wages came in. Nobody asked how long it could last. It had always lasted. It would always last. The machinery inside Salt's mill told a different story to anyone paying attention. Sections of the weaving shed still ran on equipment installed in the 1860s and 1870s. Iron-framed, belt-driven, maintained by men who had learned their craft from men who had learned it from the original workers. The machines worked, but modernizing them required capital investment that shareholders in a publicly listed company were reluctant to commit to an industry whose long-term trajectory was becoming, to those who looked carefully, increasingly uncertain. The first serious cracks appeared in the 1960s. Textile manufacturers in India, Pakistan, and Hong Kong had spent the post-war years building their own industries. Newer factories, newer machinery, and a labor force that could be paid a fraction of what a Yorkshire mill worker earned. They were not producing inferior cloth. They were producing comparable cloth at 1/5 of the cost. British import tariffs offered some protection, but not enough, and not for long. Each year through the 1960s, the price differential widened. Each year, more orders that had once gone to Bradford went elsewhere. The mills of Yorkshire began to close. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and without interruption. A mill in Halifax one year, 2 in Huddersfield the next. The closures moved through the industry like a tide, coming in slowly enough that each individual loss could be explained away, attributed to mismanagement or bad luck, until the pattern became too consistent to dismiss. At Salt's mill, the workforce contracted, quietly at first. Natural attrition, positions not refilled when workers retired, then less quietly. The 1970s brought compounding pressures from every direction simultaneously. The oil crisis of 1973 drove energy costs to levels that made running large steam-powered industrial machinery almost prohibitively expensive. Inflation eroded margins. A series of national industrial disputes disrupted supply chains. The broader British manufacturing economy was visibly contracting, and the textile industry, already weakened, had no reserves left to absorb the additional strain. By the mid-1970s, mills that had stood for a century were closing not one by one but in clusters. Bradford's identity, the one it had carried with absolute confidence since the Industrial Revolution, was being dismantled piece by piece, and no one in government or industry had a credible answer for what might replace it. Salt's mill kept running, but the spaces between the operating looms were growing wider, and the men and women working those looms already knew, in the way that workers always know before the announcements come, what the widening spaces meant. In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher's government came to power on a program that was unambiguous in its direction. Uncompetitive industries would not be protected. State subsidies would be withdrawn. The market would decide what survived and what did not. For the textile towns of West Yorkshire, this was not a policy position. It was a sentence. The redundancy notices came in waves, not all at once, never all at once. Illingworth Morris managed the contraction of Salt's Mill with the careful, incremental logic of a company trying to delay the inevitable rather than confront it. 20 workers let go in the spring, 30 more in the autumn. A section of the weaving shed closed and not reopened. A floor that had run 3 shifts a day, running only 1. Each individual announcement was presented as a necessary adjustment, a response to market conditions, a temporary measure. The cumulative effect was the systematic hollowing out of a building that had once held 3,000 people, reduced now to a few hundred, working in a vast stone shell that had been built for a different world entirely. Arthur Pickles had come to Salt's Mill in 1951 at the age of 15. He had learned to operate a loom from a man who had learned from a man who had been there when the building opened. 35 years of the same motion, the same sounds, the same particular smell of hot oil and wool dust that settled into your clothes and your hair, and eventually, you suspected, into something deeper than that. He knew the building the way you know a place you have never chosen to leave. Not its history, not its architecture, but its specific weight in the morning when you arrive. The way the light changed through the north-facing windows across the seasons. Which floorboards had the slight give in them, which looms ran slightly warm. In 1984, he watched the first of his immediate colleagues receive their notice. Then more. The gaps in the weaving shed widened around him. He was not on the list, not yet, but he understood arithmetic. Each round of redundancies left fewer people. The rounds were not stopping. He was 50 years old. He had never worked anywhere else. He did not know, in any practical sense, how to begin. He said nothing about this to anyone. There was nothing useful to say. In 1985, a Bradford-born photographer named Ian Beasley was commissioned by the director of what was then the National Museum of Film, Photography and Television to document the final working days of West Yorkshire's textile industry. Salt's Mill was the natural place to begin. Beasley spent months inside the building. He photographed the machinery, the workers, the vast empty sections of floor where looms had stood until recently. He photographed Arthur Pickles and men like him, faces that carried the particular expression of people watching something end that they had always assumed was permanent. He said afterward, "There was a sense that you were capturing a moment in history. The great spaces that had been filled with workers were suddenly empty, and the silence in them was like the silence in a church." He was still taking photographs when, in February 1986, the last loom stopped. He was ready for it. He had been watching it coming for a year. February 1986, a Friday. The temperature in Saltaire overnight had dropped below freezing. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the village was dark. The stone terraces that Titus Salt had raised from bare ground 130 years earlier stood silent along their named streets: Ada Street, Fanny Street, Herbert Street, Titus Street. The names of his children pressed into the geography of a place he had built to last forever. Ice had formed in the gutters. The river air moved black and slow beyond the mill wall. The canal beside it did not move at all. The workers came on foot as they always had. They came by habit, the same routes their fathers had walked, the same turn at the corner of Victoria Road, the same moment when the mill gate came into view, and the body adjusted automatically, unconsciously, to what the day required. Some of them had made this walk for 30 years, some for 40. Their boots on the frozen pavement made the only sound in the village. Nobody spoke. There was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been understood for weeks. They passed through the gate for the last time without marking the fact of it. Inside, the building received them as it always had. The smell reached you first, before the light, before the sound, before anything else registered consciously. Wool dust and machine oil, and the particular warmth generated by metal that has been running continuously for decades. A smell so deeply absorbed into the stone walls and the wooden floor joists that it existed independently of the machinery that produced it, as if the building itself had been permanently altered by a century of industry. Workers who had been away, on holiday, on sick leave, always remarked on it when they returned. You stopped noticing it after the first hour. This morning, nobody stopped noticing it. The looms started at 6. There were not many left running now. The weaving shed, 550 meters of floor space designed to hold 1,200 machines operating simultaneously, held a fraction of that number. The sound they made was changed by the space around them. In the years of full production, the noise had been total, a physical pressure that filled the building from floor to ceiling and left no room for anything else. Now the working looms produced a sound that echoed. You could hear individual machines within the collective, could pick out the rhythm of a specific loom across the room, in a way that had never been possible before. The emptiness amplified everything it contained. Arthur Pickles took his position at his loom and began. His hands knew the work without instruction. 35 years of the same motion had made it something below conscious thought. The check of the tension, the threading, the particular adjustment this specific machine required on cold mornings when the metal had contracted slightly overnight. He had learned that quirk in his first winter here. He had been 15 years old. He was 50 now, and the machine still needed the same adjustment on cold mornings, and his hands still made it without being asked. Around him, others worked in the same concentrated silence. By mid-morning, the first looms had completed their final runs. There was no ceremony attached to stopping them. The cloth simply ran out, the machine reached the end of its last programmed sequence, and fell quiet. Each silence was small and local, absorbed for a moment by the noise of the machine still running. Then another stopped. Then another. At noon, someone brought food to the canteen. The long tables where thousands of workers had eaten for over a century were mostly empty now. People sat apart, or in small groups of 2 and 3, and ate without appetite. On the table in the corner, someone had left a bottle of whiskey. Nobody moved to take it away. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 men in boiler suits gathered around the last working loom in Salt's mill. Ian Beasley positioned himself in the corner of the weaving shed, camera raised. He had been here for months, photographing the slow withdrawal of everything that had made this building what it was. He had photographed empty floors and departing workers and machinery being disconnected and removed. He had thought he was prepared for this moment. He discovered, standing there in the thin February light, that he was not. The 4 men began to dismantle the loom. Arthur Pickles was one of them. His hands, the same hands that had made the same adjustments to the same machine on cold mornings for 35 years, now worked in reverse, unbolting what had been bolted, separating what had been joined. The loom did not resist. It came apart with the patient, indifferent ease of a thing that does not know it is dying. Each component was lifted clear and set aside on the stone floor with a care that was, under the circumstances, quietly heartbreaking. As if precision still mattered, as if the machine might be needed again, as if this were maintenance rather than an ending. Nobody spoke while they worked. Beasley pressed the shutter. The sound of his camera was the loudest thing in the room. By 3 o'clock, the loom was down. The 4 men straightened and stood for a moment looking at the components laid out on the floor. The frame, the shuttle, the heddles, and the reed. 35 years of Arthur Pickles' working life reduced to a collection of metal parts on cold stone. Then one of the men reached to the wall panel beside where the loom had stood and turned off the power connection. The last electrical circuit in the weaving shed went dark, and Salt's mill fell silent. Not gradually, not the way the silence had been building through the morning as one loom after another stopped. This was immediate and absolute, the way silence is when the last remaining sound ceases rather than fades. One moment there was the hum of the electrical system, the faint vibration of the building that had been present for so long it had become indistinguishable from the building itself. Then there was nothing. 133 years of sound left the room in an instant. The February light came through the tall, north-facing windows and fell across the stone floor at a low winter angle, illuminating the wool dust still suspended in the air. Fine particles of fiber that had been airborne in this room since before any living person could remember. Drifting now in the sudden stillness like snow that had forgotten how to fall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. There was a sense, irrational, undeniable, that to make a sound in that moment would be a kind of violation. Arthur Pickles put his hand flat against the wall of the building. He held it there for a moment, then he took it away. They walked out through the mill gate in the early dark of a February evening. The same gate, the same street, and the same turn at the corner of Victoria Road that their bodies knew without thinking. But the walk home was different. The thing that had given the walk its meaning in both directions, the pull of the building at one end, the pull of home at the other, the working life stretched between them, was present in only one direction now. Behind them, the mill gate closed. Saltaire village was still there. The stone houses stood on their named streets as they had always stood. The church was lit. The river ran. The canal reflected the last gray light of the sky. Everything that Titus Salt had built around the mill remained intact, unchanged, exactly as he had designed it to be. But the mill itself, for the first time in 133 years, showed no light. Every window dark. The great stone facade rising against the evening sky without a single lamp burning behind it. A building the size of a palace, perfectly preserved, absolutely silent, and as empty as a sentence with nothing left to say. The whiskey bottle on the canteen table stood untouched. Nobody had gone back for it. For 1 year, Salt's mill stood empty. The windows that Titus Salt had specified, hundreds of them, tall and arched, designed to flood the interior with clean northern light, now let that light fall on nothing. Pigeons moved into the upper floors of the weaving shed, nesting in the iron framework above the vacant floor where 1,200 looms had once run. Rain found its way through sections of the roof that had gone unattended during the final contracted years of operation. Bradford City Council received proposals for the building's future and found none of them satisfactory. It was too large to repurpose cheaply, too historically significant to demolish without controversy, and too expensive to maintain without a viable use. The question of what Salt's mill would become sat unanswered through 1986 and into 1987, while the building continued its patient, indifferent existence beside the river. Then Jonathan Silver arrived. Silver was 34 years old, a Bradford-born entrepreneur who had made his money in fashion retail. He had built and sold a successful clothing business and was, by the mid-1980s, looking for something to do with both his capital and his energy. He had no background in industrial property. He had no experience managing a building of this scale. He had no plan for what Salt's mill might become. What he had, driving past the building one afternoon in 1987, was a response to it that he described afterward in the simplest possible terms. He thought it was beautiful. His advisors thought he was mistaken. The building had no functioning heating system across most of its floor area. Its electrical infrastructure was partial and outdated. It had no anchor tenant, no established footfall, no obvious commercial identity. The textile industry that had sustained it for 130 years was gone and was not coming back. Several people who knew Silver well told him directly that purchasing Salt's mill was an act of sentiment dressed up as a business decision, and that sentiment of this kind was expensive. He bought it anyway. The first call he made after the purchase was to California. David Hockney had grown up in Bradford, had attended Bradford Grammar School, had walked past Salt's mill as a boy without imagining he would one day hang his work inside it. By 1987, he was among the most celebrated artists in the world, living in Los Angeles, his paintings selling for sums that bore no relationship to the Bradford of his childhood. He and Silver had known each other since boyhood. The friendship had survived distance and divergent lives and the vast difference in their public profiles. And when Silver called him in California and said, with the directness that characterized everything he did, "I've just bought a mill in Saltaire. Do you want to show some work?" Hockney flew back to Yorkshire to look at it. He walked into the main weaving shed and stood in the center of the floor. The space was 550 meters of open floor beneath 9-meter ceilings, lit from the north through the full-length windows Salt had insisted upon 130 years earlier, precisely because he wanted his workers to see clearly. The light was even, consistent, and extraordinarily clean. The quality of light that gallery designers spend significant money and effort attempting to replicate artificially. Hockney looked at it for a long time. "It is the finest gallery space I have ever seen," he said. The 1853 gallery opened in 1993, the name taken from the year the building had first opened. The year Titus Salt had sat at the head of a table, laid for 3,000 guests, and watched his world begin. Now in the rooms where the alpaca cloth had been woven and finished and folded for export, Hockney's paintings hung on whitewashed walls, the swimming pools of California, the hills of the Yorkshire Dales rendered in colors that had no precedent in the gray palette of the industrial North, photo montages that fractured and reassembled space and time, works of a scale that required exactly the kind of room that Salt's Mill provided. Vast, light-filled, unhurried. People came, first from Bradford and the surrounding towns, many of them former mill workers or the children and grandchildren of mill workers, standing in a space they recognized from family stories and finding it transformed beyond any expectation. Then from further. The gallery's reputation spread through the art world with a speed that surprised everyone except Silver, who had known from the beginning what the light in that room was capable of. Around the gallery, the rest of the building came back to life. Shops opened, restaurants took the spaces that had been storerooms and packing floors. Technology companies, among them Pace plc, a manufacturer of satellite television equipment, established offices in the mill's upper floors, bringing a new kind of manufacturing to a building that had always been defined by making things. Jonathan Silver did not live to see it fully realized. In 1997, he was diagnosed with cancer of the pancreas. He was 51 years old. He died the same year before Saltaire received the recognition that his vision had made possible. 4 years later, in December 2001, UNESCO inscribed Saltaire as a World Heritage Site, one of the outstanding examples of industrial urban planning on Earth, preserved almost entirely intact, functioning still as a living community rather than a museum. Silver's daughter Zoe took over the stewardship of Salt's Mill. She said of her father some years after his death, "He looked at a building everyone else saw as a problem and saw a gallery." That was who he was. Titus Salt had built Salt's Mill to last. He had been right about that, at least. He could not have imagined what it would become. In December 2001, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribed Saltaire on the World Heritage List. The citation described it as an outstanding example of mid-19th century philanthropic industrial urban planning, a place that had influenced the development of model communities across the world, that demonstrated an exceptional interchange of human values that remained almost entirely intact after 150 years. The village Salt had built street by street, house by house, from bare ground beside a Yorkshire river, was now formally recognized as one of the most significant industrial sites on Earth. Bradford received the news quietly. The city had seen too much leave in the preceding decades to celebrate easily. But in Saltaire itself, in the streets named for Salt's children, along the canal towpath, inside the mill where Jonathan Silver's gallery had been running for 8 years, there was something that took a moment to identify. Not triumph, not vindication, something closer to relief. The place had been seen. After everything, it had been seen. Salt's Mill today bears little visible resemblance to the building Arthur Pickles locked up behind him on a February evening in 1986. The weaving shed where 1,200 looms once ran at 95 decibels is now the 1853 Gallery. 4 large interconnected rooms holding more than 400 works by David Hockney, the largest permanent collection of his art anywhere in the world. The paintings cover the full range of his working life: early Bradford pieces, the luminous California swimming pools, the vast Yorkshire landscape paintings made on iPad in the last decade, the 20 flower studies completed in 2025 in colors so unguarded they seem almost startling in the stone-walled northern interior. People stand in front of them in the same silence that descended on the building the afternoon the last loom stopped. But it is a different silence now, chosen rather than imposed. On the floors above, technology companies occupy the spaces where the finishing and packing rooms once operated. The third floor houses the Bradford Peace Museum, which relocated there in August 2024, an institution dedicated to the documentation of conflict and the study of its alternatives. Installed in a building that was itself born from a man's attempt to resolve the central conflict of industrial capitalism between profit and human dignity. The irony is not lost on those who think about it. The shops sell books, bicycles, antiques, art supplies, furniture by internationally recognized designers. The restaurant, Salt's Diner, occupying the space of the Old Mill Canteen, serves food to people who come from across the country for the gallery and stay for the afternoon. On the top floor, a fish restaurant looks out over the canal and the river and the hills beyond. The 850 stone houses that Salt built for his workers are still standing, still occupied. People are born in Saltaire now, grow up there, go to school there, come home there in the evenings. Not because a mill owner requires their proximity to his machinery, but because it is, by any measure, a remarkable place to live. The architecture Salt specified, the proportions, the stone, the street width designed to let in sun and air, has proved more durable than the industry it was built to serve. Arthur Pickles would be in his late 80s now. There is no record of whether he returned to Salt's mill after February 1986. Whether he walked back through the gate he had left that Friday evening, sat in the diner that replaced the canteen where someone had left an untouched bottle of whiskey on the table, looked up at the paintings on the walls of the room where his loom had stood for 35 years. Whether the building felt like his, still, or like something that had become entirely other, claimed by people who had no memory of what it had been, who moved through it lightly, unburdened by its history. Some former workers did return. They came with their children and their grandchildren, pointed to sections of the floor, said, "Here, this is where I stood. This is where the machine was. This is what it sounded like when all of them were running." Their grandchildren looked at the paintings and nodded and tried to imagine it. The gap between those two experiences, between what the building held in memory and what it offered in the present, is perhaps the most honest measure of what was lost in February 1986 and what was preserved, and what the difference between those two things actually means. There is a child in the 1853 gallery today, or there will be tomorrow, or there was yesterday, standing in front of a painting by David Hockney. The child does not know that the floor beneath her feet was walked for 35 years by a man named Arthur Pickles, or that the wall beside her once vibrated with the force of machinery running at full production, or that a woman named Margaret Illingworth stood somewhere in this room in 1865 and felt for the first time that she was a person, while also understanding, with equal clarity, that she could not leave. The child looks at the painting. Outside, the river Erie moves past the mill wall as it has moved since before the building existed. As it moved on the morning Titus Salt stood at the edge of his chosen field in the winter of 1851 and watched the first picks break the frozen ground. As it moved on the evening Arthur Pickles walked home for the last time. As it moves now, and will move long after the last person who remembers the looms is gone, Salt's mill stands beside it, still the largest building for miles in any direction, still made of the same Yorkshire stone, still facing the same northern light through the same tall windows. It does not answer the questions it raises. It simply stands there and waits and lets each person who walks through its gate decide for themselves what a paradise is worth and what it costs.